Well, welcome out to our Leadership Collective. We're going to be talking about culture in this session, and I love talking about culture. I have my good friend, Pastor Brad Straarup with me, and so excited to get into what we're talking about when it comes to culture. Anybody that attends our Fair Lawn location would tell you, I love culture, because culture isn't just something you build, it's something you be. You have to be the culture. And culture is a combination of what you create and what you allow. You need to be able to identify, like, hey, this is what we're aiming at. This is what we are. These are the things that are the values that are true about us. And there are certain things that you should be able to identify about your culture that you look at and you say, that's just not us. Certain behaviors, certain actions that you say, that's just not us. I love what Pastor Rich Wilkerson Jr. said. He said, when it comes to your culture, you need to be insanely specific. So we're going to take a few minutes today and talk about culture, talk about building culture, talk about what it looks like to create culture, to embody culture, all of those things. So wanted to just start with this, talking about and framing what is culture? What is that? What does culture look like? What is culture? And Brad, we'll go ahead and pass it over to you. I want to give you enough time to talk about this because I feel like you're such a wizard when it comes to culture. You're just great you naturally carry culture. You naturally have built culture, but you've embodied culture. You've inspired teams to have a certain culture, but you first embodied it. And those values that you have, you easily get other people to buy into those values and follow those values. So speak to it for a minute.
I think it's so helpful. Hey everyone, how are you? Is everyone doing good? Awesome. I absolutely love talking about culture. I think it's one of the most important things that you can build when it comes to church, when it comes to organizations. And if you're taking notes, I want you to write down this definition of culture. Culture is a set of collective behaviors and language that makes you uniquely you. Okay, culture is a set of behaviors and language that makes you uniquely you. When you travel the world and you start experiencing different cultures, you're going to see that they have a specific way of doing things and they have a specific language or a specific way of talking. So when it comes to creating a culture in your organization or in your church, it's the exact same thing, right? And your culture, surprisingly, is not what you say you are, it's who others say you are. Okay, culture is not who you say you are, it's who others say you are. So you walk into a building and then there's a piece of trash, right, that is sitting in your building. And often you'll be walking with someone and they'll say, I know there's trash there, but that's not our culture. Like, our culture isn't trash. But in that moment, that was your culture. Do you agree with me? If it existed in your culture, it is your culture. If it existed in your culture, it is your culture. So if you have someone on your team who, for example, is abusive and it's something that you allow, if it exists in your culture, it is your culture. So it takes leadership to continually say, okay, cool, well, we need to be able to adjust this. I wrote this down. Your culture systems are perfectly set up to give you the results you have. So whatever your culture is right now, whether you like it, don't like it, or indifferent towards it, you have created culture systems that are perfectly giving you the results you have, okay? You have perfectly created that. So ultimately, you need to be able to define that and then make a difference. When you go to Chick-fil-A, right, you see a very specific culture. Why? Because they're intentional with it. They're proactive with it. You go to McDonald's, I mean, I love a Big Mac, but let's just be honest, that culture is completely different, right? There's intentionality behind theirs too, but it's not the same as Chick-fil-A. They have perfectly created their systems to give the results ultimately that they are getting. So if you haven't considered culture, where do you start? A couple of things that I just want you to understand about why culture is so important is culture either attracts or repels people. Your culture will either attract or repel people, okay? How many of you have ever gone to a wedding and you have that friend and they're just getting married out in South Africa, we would say the Bundus, out in the middle of nowhere? How many of you have ever had that friend? It's like they aren't picking the place downtown. They are picking the place where you have to get on that highway and you have to start driving far. You know, and you're driving and you go past that first gas station that you're supposed to stop at. You know, it's clean, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. But you decide, I'm going to press on. I'm going to make it there. And then you're halfway there, and then your wife turns to you and she's like, I really need to go to the bathroom. So you're like, oh, shoot. Okay, I'm going to stop at the very next one. And then you stop at that gas station that is like terrible, right? You like need to get the key for the bathroom. Anyone know this gas station? Anyone ever been there? You're like, I need the key. So you go into the bathroom and you use the little key thing and, you open the door. You're like, don't know if you can touch it. So you kind of do the leg action and kind of get in there. And then you do your business, you do your thing. And then you come to this decision point where you stare at the sink and you have this thought process of, I think I'll be cleaner if I don't wash my hands. You ever had that? You're like, I literally think I'll be cleaner if I just kind of count my losses and I just leave. And you've all been there. But then how many of you have ever gone to like a nice restaurant, like a nice restaurant, where there's like a person with colognes as you walk in and you're like, hi. You're like, this is great. And then you go and, you do business and then you wash your hands. And they don't even have like paper towels. They have real towels. Like the real towels, and they're like even warmed for you. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is insane. You wash your hands. And then as you're going to get the towel, you kind of drip on the counter, right? And now there's all this water on the counter and you say, oh no. You say, this bathroom was clean and perfect before me. This really nice hotel. It shall be clean again. And then you take the towel and you start wiping it down because God forbid you leave it worse than you found it. Anyone ever done that? Yeah. They don't even pay you and you just became their janitor. Why? Why is it so different? Why in one place are we like, I don't even want to interact with what is happening here. But then in the very next moment, you're in a nice restaurant or you're in that nice hotel and you are wiping down their counters. It's because culture will either repel you or attract you. It will either draw you in or push you away. And it's the exact same way at your church and at your organization. My question is this: when people come into your building, when they experience what makes you you, are they drawn in? Or are they repelled? Are they welcomed? Because you have to realize that people who are coming into your church are experiencing something, right? Someone coming to your church for the very first time, what are they feeling? Let me hear from you. What are they feeling when they're walking in? Nerves. Yeah, I'm so nervous. What else are they feeling? I hope someone can see me. What else? Anxiety. What else? Fear. They're experiencing all of these different things as they're driving to your church. When they're done with your church, what do you want them to feel? Seen, known, loved, understood, accepted, cared for, like they're a part of a family. And if we don't understand that the cultures that we create have to move people from one state to another state, we don't know what we're doing. We don't understand the importance of what we're doing. We're supposed to bring them. They're nervous and they're anxious, but the second they enter into our church parking lot, and all of a sudden there's volunteers there who are happy, who are greeting them, who are pointing them to a parking spot, they get to a place where they say, oh my gosh, someone thought of me. Someone thought of me. Jesus said that they will know that you are my disciple by your love for one another. What is culture when it comes to church? Culture is creating love. And ultimately that love is either going to draw people in or it's going to repel you. So you need to know that, number one, a culture attracts or repels people. And I think another interesting thing about culture, number two, is culture is free, but it's priceless. Culture is free, but it's priceless. I think often, especially if in youth ministry, we have a budget of like, $100? You're like, it's amazing. We're going to do some amazing pizza with that 100. Like, you just don't have a massive budget, right? But that's okay because you can get creative within those limitations. But what you need to understand is that culture, it's free, but it's priceless. And all it takes is ultimately leadership to create an environment where people feel loved and cared for.
Thinking about people being loved and cared for, what type of experience, I love what Brad just said, what type of experience are people having when they come onto your parking lot because culture starts? They say that people make a determination about your church about your youth ministry within the first 90 seconds. How do they feel within that first 90 seconds? And then what do they experience when they come in? People want to be a part of something where there's energy, where there's excitement, where there's enthusiasm, where everybody's known by somebody. That's one of the things of our culture. We want a culture, I can't know everybody that comes, but everybody can be known by somebody, because one of the basic human desires is to be known. So we want to create a culture where everybody's known by somebody. And then there are specifics to culture as well. Like, we don't want the front couple rows being absolutely unenergetic, not full, kind of dead. No, we want the first 2 rows to be our culture setters who are in the front, so they're engaging during worship, they're engaging during the message, they're generating excitement, because people will feed off of whatever's happening, whatever they're being led to do. And so what are some things, what are some specifics that you can take and say, okay, here's the culture that I want, and let me think back from that. What do I need to implement to have that? One of the things I know when we started launching campuses is we stream. And so for us, with people having phones and taking notes on their phone, it just looked like we have a bunch of young people. It looked like they were all texting. And so we had people we went old school, had people start bringing Bibles and notebooks.
Wow.
And taking notes. Literally, I had a young adult that was like, this is the first notebook I've ever owned. And I said, congratulations, welcome to old school. It's great. That's what we used to have to do all the time. And so we have them bring and write. Why? Because we want to make no mistake of what's happening during the message. You're engaged, you're leaned in, you're taking notes. Guess what we have now at our campus? We have a bunch of people who take notes. We have note takers. In your student ministry, we used to always say this phrase, note takers are history makers. We said it every week. Show me your 5 friends, I'll show you your future 5 years from now. Note takers are history makers, stuff like that. Why? Because we want them being aware of the culture of their life and who they're being friends with. We want them being aware of the word as it's being preached and paying attention to it and taking notes. The other things that we say are, like, in the front rows, you've got your hands lifted in worship, not because you have to, but because Jesus gave everything so that we can come give him everything. So we have things about our culture that are identifiable based on what we want it to be. What do we want people to say? Let's reverse engineer that and figure out what we need to do in order to have people leave saying, man, that was one of the most energetic worship atmospheres I've ever been a part of. Why was that? Not because we said, hey, you all need to lift your hands, but because we vision cast that value of, hey, reminding you Jesus gave up everything so that we could come into church on a Sunday and give him everything that we are, everything we aspire to be. We could give him our worship, our surrender. And what does that do? That creates culture. So culture, here's the thing about it. You can have the best vision of all time, and if you don't have the culture to drive that vision, culture eats vision for lunch. And so it's not enough to just have a great vision. A lot of churches have a great vision, but it only goes as far as culture can drive it. So I want to ask you, even as we're talking about this, what are the specifics of your culture? What do you want to create, and how have you reverse engineered that, and what have you put into place to make that what people, I love what you said, it's what people say about you. Yes. It's not what you say about yourself. What have you done to reverse engineer so that that is what people leave saying? I love that.
Yeah, it's funny, you're talking about when people come, the first thing that they experience, they make that decision in the first 90 seconds. Have y'all ever heard of ERP? ERP. Say ERP. Yeah, it's kind of weird. ERP stands for Estimated Relationship Potential. And basically, when you meet someone for the first time, all of y'all have done this. In the first 5 minutes, normally you say, what's your name? And then you say, what do? You decide in the first 5 minutes whether or not there is any validity to having a relationship with that person. Have you ever done that? You met someone, you're like, okay, this is not going to go anywhere. I know we don't like to admit it, but that is the thing. It's the same with your church, right? When someone's experiencing your church, ERP kicks in. ERP shows up all the time. All the time he shows up. And they're saying, okay, is there a relationship that ultimately I can form with this church? And it's important to understand, the reason culture is so important is because, again, that is what brings people from one place to another. It gets them ready to ultimately hear the gospel. It gets them ready to hear Jesus. So here's the question. How do you set it? If culture is so important, how do you set it? What do you focus on? I think there's a couple things you need to focus on. Number one, you need to focus on setting the culture initially. Okay, setting the culture initially. That's what you were saying. It was saying, hey, we want to be note takers. So what we're going to do is we're going to have everyone bring in their notebooks. Okay, so the way that it works in church is you say that once and then it happens for eternity. Yes? You're like, guys, I really want us to worship. Everyone, put your hands up. You say it once and people are like, I got it, man. I'm catching that vision. We are good to go. And then, you come back a year later and you're like, man, they just really listened to me. Look at those hands. This is incredible. Like, they really love Jesus. They love me. Does that happen? No. Never. Right? You have to set the culture initially, but then you have to shape the culture continually.
Yeah, that's great.
You have to set it initially, but then shape it continually. So the question is this: how do you shape culture? Okay, I'm going to give you the secret. Write down this sentence. Culture is what you create or allow, celebrate or correct. Culture is what you create or allow, celebrate or correct. Okay? So how do you create culture? Okay, we said in the beginning, culture is a set of language and behaviors. You create culture based on its definition. How do I create it? By what you say and what you do. Okay? So if you want people to lift up their hands, be the example. You do it. If you want people to do it, you have to say it, right? And that can happen through leadership teachings. That can happen through all these different ways. You can listen to certain stories that are happening within your church and say, how can I capture that moment? And how can I take a label for that story and ultimately build it into our culture? I'll give you an example. One time we were teaching about ownership, okay? How many of you would love a leadership team that takes a whole bunch of ownership, right? You're like, yes, please. And one of the things that we were noticing is that what people were doing when it came to actually running projects is they were going 50-50, okay? So what that means is, I'm gonna do my part, but you do your part, okay? Has anyone ever seen that? I'm gonna do my part, you do your part. Here's the challenge. If the other person doesn't do their part, what happens? The project falls apart, right? It just doesn't work. You, come up here. Okay, come stand here. What's your name? Will. Everyone say, hi, Will. Okay, you can stand right over here. Let's just pretend you and I were climbing a mountain, okay? We are the alpinist. Okay, we're gonna do this. We're gonna climb these amazing mountains. And I said, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go 50-50, okay? So I said, okay, you go 50 and I go 50. You can hold my hand, okay? Now we're climbing the mountain, okay? We have one point of contact. Do you agree with me? He went 50, I went 50. If we let go, I'm sorry, but at that point, your life would potentially not be here still. So 50-50 is probably not a good idea, okay? But what if I overreached, okay? What if I said, I'm gonna go 100 and I want you to go to 100? Now we have 2 points of contact, okay? If I let go, he still has me, okay? Hold on. If I let go, he still has me, okay? And if he lets go, you let go, I still have him. Does that make sense? That is overreaching, okay? So I went 100 and you went 100. So we're gonna be the kind of culture that goes 100. Okay, we're not gonna go 50, we're gonna go 100. Okay, thank you, give it up for Will. So that's an example. I just created culture in this moment. I taught you guys a principle that there is a label attached to it, and that label is what? Overreaching. You can go out there right now and you can say to someone, hey, I'm just gonna overreach real quick. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're like, let me explain the story. And you can give that exact same example, and now you're teaching culture. Well done, you are a culture carrier, and now you are teaching it. It happened through communication, right? So that happened in a teaching, and the next thing, what we started noticing is all the staff were walking around and they were like, hey, I wanna overreach real quick. I want to overreach real quick. I want to overreach. And we all understood what that meant. And it basically meant, hey, I know this isn't my job, but I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions to make sure that everything is A-okay. Okay? What were they doing? They were taking ownership. So that's an example of creating culture by what you say. Culture is what you create or allow, celebrate or correct. So that's create. Okay? The next thing is allow. Okay? When you're in a meeting and something happens, when you're leading and something happens that breaks your culture, if you don't say anything, in that moment you created culture. So someone is mean to that person and basically takes them apart and you don't say anything, in that moment you just said, I co-sign on what happened. Okay? I remember once we were teaching a communication class and a bunch of people came in and they weren't incredibly prepped, and it just didn't go super well. And there was a leader that wanted to now speak up and give them advice. And he was like, guys, you need to do better than that. You know what I do? When I'm going to lead my huddle at church, I practice on my drive to the huddle. You need to do that too. And I sat there and I heard him say it, and I didn't correct that. Okay? And I just let it happen. At that point, I have all these brand new communicators that are like, okay, I guess that's what we do here. We rehearse on our drive, and that's it. I had to go back the next day and say, guys, I apologize. That's not what we do. Okay, we take it more seriously than that. And I should have said something, and I apologize that I didn't. That's my fault. The truth is, we rehearse way before that. And this is how we rehearse, okay? In that moment, I allowed culture. So it doesn't happen by default. If you just default, your culture will drift. Okay, so it's what you create or allow. Celebrate. Okay? Whenever someone walks into a culture, they're like, who are the people being celebrated? And how can I do more of that? So if you have a set of values, love for God, love for people, pursue excellence, choose joy, in every meeting, in every conversation, how can you build in celebration? We're going to celebrate the best staff member of the month, and Jacob, it's you. How can you, when you're making decisions in meetings, say, okay, guys, is that truly pursuing excellence? How can you build it in there, right? Through what you're celebrating. And the other thing is what you're correcting, which I talked about. There comes a point where someone breaks your culture, and ultimately you have to say something about it. Right now, there's ways to correct, which I think is valuable. If someone breaks your culture privately, correct them privately. Please. Please. Do not correct them publicly. Okay? If someone breaks your culture publicly, correct it publicly, in love, and in the moment. Okay? And that goes back to allowing. If someone publicly breaks your culture and everyone sees it, you have to say something in the moment. So you kind of need to have some ways to practice what to say, how to say it, that it doesn't look like you're bashing that person. Okay? But private culture breaks get corrected privately. Public culture breaks get corrected publicly. Patterns, culture patterns that you're seeing can be corrected publicly, but you have to take the personnel out of it. So if you start seeing, man, we just have a culture of pride or ego, or I'm seeing entitlement, or I'm just seeing a lot of resentment. You need to figure out, how can I address this publicly? How can I correct this pattern while not flaming the 3 or 4 people I saw it from? Does that make sense? Culture is what you create or allow, celebrate or correct. Therefore, there's a part of culture that is systematic. You have to choose to do it. However, there's also a part of culture that's organic. Okay? I didn't plan to have that corrective conversation. I didn't plan to have to not allow that thing. Okay, so when you're a culture carrier, you're always on your guard. And you're always listening, and you're always watching, and you're always asking questions. And at any given point, you're going to be making a decision. Okay, this is a moment where I need to create. This is a moment where I need to allow or not allow. Okay? Someone's afraid of failing, and sometimes you see that they're going to do something, and you're like, that might not work. Sometimes, if you're creating a culture that's okay with failing forward, sometimes you need to allow that to happen. Does that make sense? Create or allow, and then you're like, okay, no, sometimes I need to correct this, and sometimes I need to celebrate it. Those are your 4 gears at any point that you're switching into.
Find that you get stuck sort of in one gear organizationally. I know for a season here at Faith Family, we were heavy critique, like very heavy critique. And it was causing people, it was critique without a whole lot of celebration, just mostly critique. And so we had some like really good critiquers, and we got really critical. Almost there's a difference between like healthy critique and then like being openly critical. And so it bordered on that line. So we found, okay, we need to recalibrate this. We need to get out of this gear. And not that critique is bad, but we've got to get this back in balance So we need to intentionally be celebratory. We need to intentionally celebrate. So here's what we did. We started as leaders because leaders go first. If you don't, what you don't see, you've got to be it to see it. And so we're like, okay, we'll go first. Let's, as leaders, let's start celebrating in our staff gatherings. We have a staff advance every Tuesday morning. We're like, okay, let's start celebrating. So we started calling people out. And then people weren't wanting to call other people out. So we started positively enforcing it with a Starbucks gift card. If you called somebody out, I kid you not, you got a $5 Starbucks gift card. So guess what? We started positively reinforcing it. Hey, whoever calls somebody out, you're going to get a $5 Starbucks gift card, coffee on us. So people in the staff started calling each other out, started saying the good things, calling out the good, celebrating. Now we do a staff advance, and if we do a call out time or a celebration time, we can't stop it. Like literally we have to stop it to go to the next meeting because it goes the whole length of the time and beyond. But it started where we were, and now it's all the way to where we wanted it to be. And so don't despise when it comes to building culture. Don't despise the small beginnings, and do whatever you have to ingrain that in people. Now, if you come to one of our locations, they would tell you, like the Fairlawn location, which has been birthed out of this Freedom location, they'd be like, oh yeah, this is one of the most celebratory cultures I've ever been in. Well, it hasn't always been that way. We had to build that. And so you might find yourself, you were talking about the gears, you might find yourself stuck in one and needing to make some revisions.
I think that's so helpful because I've seen that as well, and sometimes it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, okay, we need to push that celebration gear a whole lot more, or sometimes it's we need to refine how we're using that correction gear. Because there's a difference between correction and critique and critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Critique is good, correction is good. Critical is not. Does it make sense? So there's even a level of that. And obviously there's a biblical process about how we go about correcting people. But here's the thing, poor correction can damage and hurt people. Poor correction can damage and hurt people. And in trying to create a culture of loving God and loving people, hopefully you don't end up hurting a lot of people because you're trying to teach them to love God and love people. Does that make sense? Like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And what you need to know is correction is a development process, not a disciplinary process. Correction is a development process. Okay, there's a difference between condemnation and conviction. Okay, ultimately, condemnation is I suck. Okay, if they walk away from your meeting and they say, I suck, we have failed in the way that we correct. Okay, but conviction, they walk away and they say, okay, I can do better. Like I can do better. There's a difference between even the way that the enemy will condemn us and the Holy Spirit will convict us. And what you see every time, and you guys have felt it, you've had those moments where the Holy Spirit has convicted you, and always it's, okay, wait, I'm better than this. It feels different. Does that make sense? So we need to make sure that we're not actually adding to the voice of the enemy in the way that we correct people. We have to do it with love, with grace, and with truth. All of that has to be in play at all times. So something else that I thought was interesting, I had this friend of mine, and he worked for Chick-fil-A, talking about creating culture organically. And if you say to someone at Chick-fil-A, you say, thank you, what do they say? My pleasure. I don't know if this is at all Chick-fil-A's, but one of the things that he said was he was never taught to say my pleasure. He was like, they never actually sat down and said, hey guys, this is what we say. Right? Because there's a level of, now you're just saying it because someone told you to say it. He said to me, no one told me to do it, I just caught it. And I think that's the powerful thing about organic culture and when there's consistency and alignment in that culture. And sometimes it does have to do with putting down your preferences, right? If you're going to truly embrace a culture. For example, on the count of 3, I want everyone to shout out your favorite color. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. I heard, okay. Guys, give it up for color. It's such a, is that fuchsia? No, it just doesn't work, okay? But right now we have some beautiful yellow. So for the sake of the illustration, let's just pretend your favorite color is yellow. On the count of 3, I want you to shout out your favorite color. 1, 2, 3. When we're unified, we're powerful. When we're unified, we're powerful. It was clear. So sometimes being in a culture, it's happening organically, but sometimes it's choosing you know what, that may not be my preference. I may like worship that actually sounds like hardcore or rock or all of these other genres. No, but this is what we're doing, so I'm going to lay down my preference. Does that make sense? So I think it's interesting how it can happen organically.
So you talked a little bit about just how you critique. And I think that's so important because there are some things that should just never be allowed if you want a healthy culture. You talked a lot about what you allow, what you create, what you allow. There are some things that should never be allowed, never be tolerated. For you in building healthy culture, because everybody here, I'm assuming you're here because you want to build a healthy culture. You don't just want it to be a culture, you want it to be a healthy one. What are some things that should never be tolerated, never be allowed?
Anything that breaks or comes against the word of God or your values. Okay? If you see any of those, ultimately you can never allow that. So for example, abuse. You can never allow abuse. You cannot allow dishonesty, disunity, lack of integrity, arrogance, pride, ego, laziness, entitlement, mistreating people, being inconsiderate. There are some things that you need to have a zero tolerance policy for. Does that make sense? And there may be a process for that. For example, gossip. Someone may gossip and you're not like, you're fired, right? Like the apprentice. Like you're not going to do that. You're going to have a corrective conversation, but ultimately there needs to be some kind of, hey, we're better than this. Okay? And here's a great way to have a corrective conversation. When this is something that I've seen, and when we do this, this is how it doesn't move us forward.
That's good.
Okay? Try your best to stick to facts and not emotions. Okay? I saw you do this, and the thing is, you're prideful. You don't know that. I mean, I'll be honest, I have a hard time defining my own motives. Never mind someone else's. Right? I can't define your motive. I don't even know mine. And last time I checked in the Bible, it's only God who truly understands why we do what we do. Right? Now, there's a place to ask questions and figure that out, but when you're having a corrective conversation, stick to what actually happened. Okay? Because that's something that can't be disputed. Hey, this is something that I saw. I saw this happen. Help me understand why that happened. And you get an understanding, and then you say, okay, when we do this, this is how it doesn't move us forward. Or when we do this, this is how it does move us forward. And ultimately, I know that God has placed such an incredible calling in you, and I'm going to call you to something higher because I know that there is more in you. That there is more in you, that you're better than this, and I'm going to call you to that standard. Right? Ultimately, that's what you want to do more than anything else. Because that's the difference between condemnation and ultimately conviction. So put that in your mind, one of the most helpful things that I think you can do.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And when you're pastoring people, it's course correction, right? You do it with the heart of a shepherd, and it's just course correction. It looks a lot less like a hammer coming down. It looks a lot more like the rod of a shepherd steering them in the right direction. And I've been in cultures and seen where it can feel like a hammer coming down, and you're building culture right there with how you correct. Guess how they're going to go correct somebody the next time that something happens.
So good.
They're going to do it like that. They're not going to do it with the heart of a pastor. They're not going to do it with the shepherd's heart. So it's not a hammer, it's a rod. You're steering them in the right direction. You're course correcting. And course correcting is a lot easier. And the other thing that I've seen is things get bottled up, like they don't get dealt with. It gets allowed for a period of time. And it's because the leader doesn't want to offend anybody or doesn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, and they've created these thoughts in their mind. They've made it way bigger than it is. If it's a hammer thing, yeah, that's a big thing. But course correction, no, it's because you care. It's because you see potential. It's because you want to call people up. And as leaders, we always have to care about people enough to call them up to a higher standard. People will rise to the level of expectation that you set. They won't rise to the level of expectation that you just expect but don't communicate. And so you have to communicate that. One of the ways that you do is to positively reinforce it by course correcting.
I think the Bible actually speaks to that. It says that we need to catch the small foxes before they ruin the vine. And I think there's something to be said about catching those small moments before it gets too big, right? Not allowing resentment ultimately to build up. You need to have those moments where you can have those conversations. And I want you guys to write down this phrase because I think it's one of the most helpful things when it comes to correction, hard conversations. It's this: help me understand why. Help me understand why.
That's great.
Hey, I saw this happen. Help me understand why. And often what I found is sometimes I'll have an idea as to why someone did something, and I would actually think their action was incorrect. But once I understand their thought process, I actually realize, okay, I was completely 100% off. And there's been times that I've corrected people and have immediately said it, and then later they explain why they did what they did, and then I realized I was in the wrong. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the most important principles there is seek first to understand before you seek to be understood. Seek first to understand. And I feel like it's one of the best principles and it's the most underutilized. And I feel like one of the best ways that you can utilize that principle is by asking that one simple question. Hey, help me understand why you did this. Help me understand why that happened. Help me understand how we got to this place. And not in a bad, angry way, but in a beautiful way. Make this your goal, that when you correct someone, they'll be able to walk away and just be like, oh my gosh, I love being corrected by Brad. Like, it is just my favorite thing ever. My wife's one of the best people at this. She can cut you and you don't even know you've been cut. You're just like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. You ultimately need to try and create that kind of experience, right? And also be the kind of person that when someone corrects you, they walk away saying, I'm gonna correct Brad more. Man, what an easy guy to correct. Because I'm like, thank you, that's so helpful. Wow, you're so wise, please give me more. Right? Create a culture where correction isn't seen as something to be despised, but something to be embraced.
It's great, because what you're talking about is a spirit of pride. If you can't receive correction well, the Bible says that who God loves, he corrects. As a leader who I love, who I believe in, I'm gonna be frequent in course correcting them. And if you have pride build up in you, you're not gonna wanna receive correction. Guess what everyone that you're leading is gonna catch from you? They're gonna catch that spirit of pride, so they're not gonna be open to it either. So as leaders, we look at ourselves 10 times before we look at anyone else once. And we say, okay, is there anything in me that needs adjusted or changed when it comes to the spirit that I carry? Because people are going to catch what you carry ultimately. And so that's huge.
I think one more thing, and then we can open up for questions about what you were saying about if someone is correcting you, you need to understand that it's done in love, and God corrects us because he loves us. And have you ever had those moments where you have someone who is not living for God and it just seems like everything in their life goes their way? Have you ever seen that? You're like, and I just don't understand it. There is a Bible verse that talks about how God will correct us and will give us time. But ultimately, if we're unrepentant, the Bible says that he turns them over for his wrath. A dad who corrects his son loves his son, has hope for his son, believes that his son can do better. A dad who stops correcting his son has lost hope for his son. Does that make sense? Ultimately, if I keep correcting you, it's because I love you. And it's because I see what God has put inside of you, and I want to mine that out. And I actually think that's a helpful language. It's like a helpful language point. Because there's been moments in your life where you've had someone that you're working for, and maybe you get to this place where you realize this isn't working out. And maybe I need to release this person. If you have a staff or you have someone on your team, you'll notice that once you make that decision, you stop correcting them. Why? Well, you've lost hope. So it's a helpful point to say, hey, the reason we continue to have these conversations is because I believe in you. It's because I believe in you. It's because I see what God has placed inside of you. And as long as I'm correcting you, you need to know this, that I love you and I am for you. And I am not against you. I am beside you. I'm standing back to back with you, and we're going to do this together. Does that make sense? Again, we do it all in love.
That's great. Let's open it up for a few questions. We have time for just a few. So any questions about culture? I see a hand up back in the back.
Red plaid shirt. Come on now.
Thank you.
Love it.
How do you deal with those who feel like they have entitlement and you're talking to a group and not feel like you're trying to single them out?
So there was one person in the group that has entitlement, or the entire group has entitlement?
Let's just say 2 out of an entire group.
And when you say it, you're like, everyone's like, oh my gosh, he's talking to Jack. It depends how large. I think it does depend how large the group is. If it's a group of 5 and everyone has seen it and you're choosing to a place where you're now going to address it and everyone's going to know for certainty that you're talking about a single person, I feel like sometimes maybe a more direct approach in love may be more helpful. But again, you kind of need to use your EQ. I've led a group of campus pastors before, and there was one campus pastor who was incredibly aggressive. And I can't come into the meeting and be like, guys, after last week's meeting, I'm going to talk about aggression. Because they're like, oh my gosh, yes, he is totally coming for you. Does that make sense? So in that moment, you almost have to kind of talk about the elephant in the room. And one of the things that, again, this was a culture within our small meeting, as we said that we're going to throw the grenade on the table. Okay? In other words, I'm going to address it right here and right now because I'm rather going to do that than allow conversations to happen by the water cooler. And what we said is we're going to lock these doors and we're going to hash some stuff out. And we may throw some chairs. We may draw blood. But we are going to leave here unified. And it was the worst 4-hour meeting you have ever seen in your life. And we walked out brothers. Like we walked out brothers. And at that point, it took a direct approach. So I would say that if it's a smaller group, you do kind of need to use your EQ. If it is a larger group, so for example, if there was someone here who was speaking about entitlement, it's probably rare that someone's going to make that connection. But whenever you are creating culture, again, right now we're teaching leadership principles and things like that. You can't go wrong with using the Bible. In fact, always use the Bible when you're creating culture. Every leadership tool, every great business book you have, there are principles that can be found in God's word. And ultimately allow the Bible to say it for you. Does that make sense? Then people are going to feel less attacked and like you're coming for them. And more specifically, hey, this is something that I read. Another thing that I think is helpful when it comes to correcting in a group, and I had a friend of mine teach me this. There's a difference between the tower voice and the worker in the field. Okay? The tower voice is the person who is in the tower watching people saying, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this, you should do that. And the worker in the field is the person who is with them saying, hey guys, we can do this together. So my question is this, whenever I'm correcting entitlement or whenever I'm correcting anything like that, there is probably some place in my life where that fruit is evident in my own life. And I'm going to call that out first. Hey guys, as I've been reading the Bible, there's been something that I've seen in my own life. And I've really struggled with this. And there's moments that I've seen it in this way and this way. And as God's dealing me with this, I feel like we need to have a conversation about it. Does that make sense? Come from a place where it cuts you. I'm always afraid of a leader who comes and they're teaching in that tower voice and they haven't taken the bark out of their own eye before they try to take the speck out of someone else's eye. Be very, very careful. So sometimes you need to address it directly, and sometimes you can use scripture, but start with yourself. Yeah. Always start with yourself. Does that help?
That's good.
Great.
That's good. Any other questions? Got time for one more. If we're all good, we're all good. Okay, we got one right there.
Will, my man Will.
Coming through.
He's like, can I go rock climbing with you? Yes.
How did you learn all this? Where did you glean from? Where did a lot of this come from for you? Because, I don't have access to you. So where can I find this for myself?
One thing, brad.straarup@highlandscollege.com is my email address. You 100% have access to me. And as much as I can help, I want to be able to do that. And the reason I say that is because I had leaders expose themselves to me and say, hey, I want to be able to help you. Like, I want you to be able to ask me any questions that you can. So a lot of these principles I learned from leaders, I really did. And a lot of times I read a ton of books, listen to a ton of audiobooks all the time. In fact, sometimes even on YouTube, I listen to the summaries of books and I'm like, that gave me what I needed. Because sometimes they say what they want to say in the first chapter and then it's 10 chapters restating what they need to say. But I think the more that you can expose yourself to leaders, the more that you can embrace virtual mentors, whether that's like the Craig Rochelle Leadership Podcast, the Andy Stanley Leadership Podcast. In fact, Craig Rochelle has some incredible stuff on culture. And then having personal conversations. And then the third thing is this, be an observer of life. Yeah. Just be an observer of life. And anytime you see someone doing something well, success leaves clues. Okay, and there is a pattern behind it. Everything in life is created through a system. A system is an input, a process, and there is an output. Again, I've said this before, look at how a tree is formed. What do you see? You see a system. Look at how a baby is formed. What do you see? You see a system. Right? God is a God who has created things in systems. Nothing is haphazard. So if someone is doing something in a great way and you can see it, go ask them the question. Right? Now, sometimes they may not even be able to define it because it's so natural to them. There's a saying that says, a fish is the last to discover water. It's just so normal to them, it doesn't even realize it's there. And only when a fish jumps out of water does it realize, oh wait, there's actually a difference here. So sometimes they may not even be able to describe it, but as you see it and the questions that you ask, you can get there. Does that make sense? So expose yourself to mentors, ask questions, be observer of life.
It's great. Can we hear it for Brad real quick? Awesome. Thank you so much.